Greetings from Columbia Business School, Executive Education. My name is Scott Gardner, and I'm very happy to be here today with Professor Paul Ingram for today's webinar, Leadership Tools to Survive and Thrive Through the Current and Future Crises. Before I introduce Professor Ingram, I'd like to just go over a few quick logistics. If you look at your screen, a recording of this webinar will be made available after the webinar. If you'd like to tweet about this webinar, please do so at hashtag CBSExecEd. And please submit those questions to the Q&A box, and Paul and I will get to as many of those as possible in the last 10 minutes. And one other logistic, Paul will be conducting a couple of poll questions, so if you can have your camera ready to take some photos, we'd appreciate that. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Ingram. He is the Kravis Professor of Business at Columbia Business School, where he has received the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence, won the Commitment to Excellence Award, voted by graduating EMBA students 5 times. His research has been published in more than 60 books, articles, book chapters. His publications have received numerous distinctions, including the Gould Prize and the Best Paper Awards in the area of organization and management theory and collective behavior and social movements. He has consulted on issues of organizational design and strategy to leading companies in the finance, healthcare, insurance, energy, and consumer products industries. Paul's undergraduate degree is from Brock University, where he received the Governor General's Award as the top graduating student and received his PhD from Cornell University. He is also the co-faculty director of the upcoming live online program beginning this June, Crisis Leadership. Paul, it's great to be with you today.
Thank you, Scott. It's great to be here.
Great. So before I leave the stage, and then I will rejoin you in the last 10 minutes, I'd just like to ask the question that truly came up the most often from those who signed up for the webinar, and that is, what is most important to succeed in a crisis?
Oh, Scott, I think that's a great question, and I think it's probably the question that has brought most of the audience here today. I do have a concise answer. My answer to that question is that leadership is the key to success in a crisis. But of course, while that answer is concise, it's not yet complete. I think we all want to know what we should be doing to be effective leaders at a time of crisis. And that's really what I'd like to talk about with you over the next 30 minutes. And leading in a crisis is hard. I think we're all discovering that. So in particular, I'd like to focus on 3 of the points of real tension. Actually, they're issues that sometimes our intuition leads us wrong at a time of crisis, and to get your insights and to give you some advice from my experience teaching and researching crisis leadership. So as I said, I would really love to pull in your perspective over the next half an hour, and here's a way for us to do that. I've got 3 polls for you. And you can participate in the polls if you care to go to the QR code. If you aim the camera on your phone to the QR code, you don't need to take a picture, just aim the camera. You will be invited to a link that will go to my polling site, or you could type in the address, which is there at the bottom of the screen, pollev.com/paulingram296. I hope many of you can join us. If you can't get there one way or the other, you can record your answers to the poll questions and you'll see everybody else's answers and you'll be a full participant. So here's the first question I have for you. How should decisions be made in a crisis? And the options I'm going to offer you are decisively. Crises demand that a leader steps up, gets in the middle of decisions, is in control. Or we could think about the possibility of diffuse leadership. Crises are complex. No one has all the answers. Leaders should get out of the way and let the team decide. Right? So I can see your responses are coming in, and I'll invite you to keep submitting them. We're now into the hundreds. And let me show you what your colleagues have said to this question so far. So we're getting a little bit of divergence here, but I would say overall, quite a substantial support for decisive leadership, control over the decision process. Now, I think there's something to be said for both these perspectives, and there's a good reason for answering either A or B, but I'm going to offer you my own view drawn from advice and experience from crisis leadership And it's going to advocate for something in between the two extremes. Now, I want to start with what I think is one of the traps of crisis leadership. And in fact, it was true that most of you, 2/3 of our audience, thought that, well, leaders have to be in control and decisive at a moment of crisis. So I'm going to call that, or maybe a caricature of that position, a dominant leader view. And lots of people think that in a crisis. I think it's our leadership instincts, but I want to suggest to you that it can be a kind of trap. Not that it's not coming from something important. People do need the presence of a leader at a crisis, and we're going to talk about how to fulfill that need. But when it comes to decisions, too much influence by the leader can be suboptimal. And here's the reason. It comes actually from the definition of a crisis. The definition I use is that a crisis is a novel, complex situation where the stakes are high. And if you take the first two elements of that definition, that crises are novel and complex, you understand the limits of the leader, or really of any one individual, for making decisions and finding a way forward in the crisis. Nobody has experience in the crisis as it is currently constituted. No one's previous experience is perfect. There's no theories or evidence that can completely tell you what to do. So crises are really beyond the limits of any one brain. And if a leader gets too central in the decision process, there's a risk that he or she may crowd out the diverse input, which is typically required to make optimal decisions in a crisis. Right? So that's a problem with the leader doing too much in terms of crisis decisions. What about the other extreme? What if the leader just stands back and lets everybody else do their thing? Well, the problem with that, as you realize, is that people do need leadership. They have to coordinate their efforts. They have relevant perspectives, but they need to integrate their perspectives with other parts of the organization. So there is a role for the leader, even though it is not dominating the decision process. So I'm going to suggest a position in between. And the label I'm going to offer you for that position is that you would like to be a prioritizing leader at a moment of crisis. Now, what I have in mind here is actually illustrated by something I learned from the New York Fire Department. We've had a great chance to do some leadership courses and training with them. And one of the things I learned about their response to the crises, the novel, complex, high-stakes situations that they face every day, is that when they have a team of firefighters who go into a burning building to fight the fire, the leader of that team, the commander on site, always stays outside the fire. Right? He or she does not get mixed up in the operations, but instead stands outside where they can maintain perspective and let everybody in the actual fire know the priorities and have access to the information that can only come from that overall perspective. Right? So the leader has to keep the big picture during a time of crisis and make sure that the people who are in the mix of things don't lose track of that big picture. Right? So the first piece of advice I have for you is to be a prioritizing leader. Don't get pulled into the mix. Even though you might be able to contribute there, there's something that only the leader can do, which is have the perspective overall. Now let's go to another dilemma. I've got another question for you. You can just answer this on the same site that hopefully you're still logged into. Do you agree or disagree with the statement that you cannot plan or prepare for a crisis? Right? Agreeing would mean that you can't plan for a novel situation. You got to make up responses as you go. Disagreeing would be to say that good planners can anticipate contingencies. They could be ready for crises. Right? So I can see your responses coming in. We're crossing into the hundreds now. Great to have your participation. And you can keep entering, but I'm going to show where we are currently. And we have quite almost a near consensus around the idea that you can plan and prepare for crisis. And I agree with that position, but we also have to have the understanding about exactly what planning and preparing for a crisis means. And again, I'd like to point to you to two ends of an extreme that crisis leaders should avoid. One, and I think you were all, almost all conscious of this, is that you cannot be rigid in the sense that you should expect to take a plan off the shelf or procedures that are completely in place and just unroll them in response to a crisis. The reason for that is the crisis is novel, right? Nobody has the foresight to completely plan and prepare, right? So you've got to have humility about your plans. But the other end of the continuum, the idea that planning would play no purpose at all, again, we're faced with the fact that in a complex situation, your organization has interdependencies. There's going to have to be coordination between the pieces, and just allowing things to unfold in a laissez-faire way would be chaotic, right? So what is the space in between? And to give us an insight for that, I'd like to share a quote with you. It comes from a leader many of you will know. You might know that Dwight Eisenhower was a general for the Allied forces during the Second World War. You might know that he was president of the United States in the 1950s, but perhaps you don't know that before he became president of the United States, he was actually president of my university, of Columbia University. And something he said about responding to the most difficult situations, I think is very relevant for our current question. He said that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. Right now, in what sense are plans worthless? Well, I think that's the humble statement that you cannot really expect to anticipate in uncertain, complex situations exactly what you'll need, right? So you're not going to be able actually to take out your plan and follow it. But in what sense is it true that planning is everything? Well, what Eisenhower is actually saying there is that the process of planning actually arms you and the people you lead to respond to the unexpected. He's actually telling us something really true and important about improvisation, that improvisation isn't actually not purely responding in the moment. Instead, it relies on previous elements that you may have prepared, practiced, planned for. Now, you can't take those plans and process elements completely, but there could be pieces from one plan or another plan or another plan that you could take and recombine in a current situation. That's actually what improvisation and indeed innovation of all kinds is. It is not creating things completely new, but it is rather drawing on elements previously prepared, lessons from history, and combining them to prepare something which is what you need in the moment, right? So this is what I'm going to label being an improvisational leader, facilitating improvisation. And this actually relies on having a respect for planning and the past. Now, this is something which is, I think, really useful for us all to remember at this moment. Here we are now, some 3 to 4 or 5 months into a crisis, and we're talking about the role of planning. You might think, well, the possibility of planning is past, that boat has sailed. But actually, I think we'll all admit that we don't know how the current crisis is going to unfold. And it seems quite possible that it is going to continue for months, maybe for years. So there still is a lot of uncertainty in front of us. And leaders now who are thinking about contingencies, thinking about scenarios, and helping their organization prepare for worlds that may occur are actually going to be better prepared when something unexpected happens months from now. So the possibility to put this idea to work is not past us. We could still do it now. My final question for you: what about communication? Should leaders communicate efficiently in a crisis? Wait until they know what the team needs and then give them all the answers? Or should the leader be an effusive communicator, tell people everything the leader knows, tell them all the time as soon as they know it? Or I'll give you a third option this time. Do you think maybe this is a trick question and that the right answer is neither of those two extremes? Keep registering your results. We're crossing the mark of 100 entries now, so I'll show you where we are, but continue to answer. And I can see that you're on to my technique now. Most people are saying, well, the answer must be somewhere between saying nothing until you have all the answers and saying everything you know. And indeed, that's the position I would recommend to you. The bigger trap that I see too many leaders falling into, actually, including in this current crisis, is the idea that they should keep quiet until they have all the answers. Now, that comes from a place we can understand. It's really a sense of responsibility as the leader, that the leader's voice is amplified. You don't want to say too much. You do feel a responsibility for coming up with answers and ways forward. But the problem with that is that people need to hear from the leader at a moment of crisis. And if they don't hear anything, they're going to fill in the silence with rumors, with things that may seed fear and could undermine the organization. Right? So silence is not your friend in a crisis. But go to the other extreme. What about a leader who is always saying everything that he or she hears and knows? Well, the problem with that is it's amplifying complexity. There's so much noise that comes out of that, that the sense making and the work on the ground that the people in the organization need to do is going to be interfered with. So, what's the position in between? Well, my label for this position is what I call a present leader. And I want to give you an example from an organization that I've had the pleasure of working with. One of the hospital systems in New York, which of course is being at the center of the response in the United States to this crisis. And the leadership team in that organization, during the height of their intense activity over the last few months, had daily briefings via video with the whole organization. Now, these briefings, of course, were concise. People had a lot of work to do. But every day, the top leadership was there, showing they were present, showing that they had their fingers on the pulse of the organization, sometimes providing information that they thought everybody needed to know, but of course, not a dump of all of the data that is coming across their desk. And I heard from people in this organization what a difference it made to them at some of the most difficult moments, to be able to see this daily reminder that their leadership was there with them in the hospital and at the helm steering the organization forward. Nobody expects the leaders to have all the answers, but knowing that they are with you and working makes all the difference. So a present leader. So let me pull together the pieces of effective crisis leadership that we've talked about. I want to offer you an acronym. My suggestion to you is that during crises, you think about being a PIP as a leader. Now, PIP has different meanings, but here's the one that I have in mind. A PIP is an excellent or very attractive person. So a PIP leader is doing in a crisis what the organization needs. And to remind you, that is to prioritize, to stay above the fray, but make sure people who are in the action know what is most important for the organization, know what success means and the main levers to get to success, to facilitate improvisation, which means planning and practice, but understanding that that's the raw material, not the end product, and your plans are going to be reformulated in response to the unexpected, and to be present. That communication during a crisis should be consistent. You should be in front of the organization, letting them know that you are there with them and for them, but of course concise, so you don't overwhelm them with detail and create a kind of noise that amplifies the complexity that is there, right? So crisis leadership has a lot of elements. We have, days of classes and engagement and exercises that we use at the Columbia Business School to help leaders become more effective. But I wanted to distill for you three of what I think are the best practices and their responses to challenges that sometimes our intuition as a leader takes us in the wrong direction during a crisis. Now, I would love to turn to make this an interaction. And I know that the team has been collecting some of your questions, and I'm going to ask for Scott to share some of those with me so we can have a two-way dialogue.
Absolutely. Paul, thank you so much. I hope you're hearing me okay.
Yeah, great.
Such good information. It's so interesting. And I want to kick this off by a question that I saw it came in a few times. So I think it's a good kickoff question. And I would like to remind everyone to continue to send those questions. This is live, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. So Paul, one question that came in is, what is the single biggest mistake that leaders are tending to make during a crisis?
I would say that if I had to point to one thing, it is to do too much themselves, right?
Mm,
So it is absolutely, the leader is integral to success during a crisis, but you've got to represent that necessity with some humility. The leader will not have all the answers in the crisis. You've got to lead in a way that optimizes input from the organization. And sometimes what the organization needs most from the leader is not a kind of dominant upfront, operational activity, but a support from behind for the people who may be better placed to access the necessary information and actually have the impact on the stakeholders of the organization. So I think that leaders in a crisis have to know that they're necessary, but they've got to approach that with a humility, really, that their role is to get the most out of the organization, not to solve the challenges themselves.
right. And there's that fine line between making sure that they know you're there and always being there, like being down in the weeds, but being above, Yeah. All right. Well, another question came in from Krishna, and this is an interesting one. It says, is it true in your experience that a good crisis time leader may not necessarily be good at normal
Mm.
times?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question, but I have an answer that I hope will be reassuring for all of us. I've taught leadership for 30 years, and the last few years we've been kind of intense in the subject of crisis leadership. In fact, we were running programs in crisis leadership just as the current crisis was coming onto the agenda, which was a very interesting time. But the good news I hope I have for all of you as leaders is that I think that the best practices of crisis leadership are the best practices of leadership. That really, crises require distilled leadership. The effect of good leadership is amplified, but the techniques are really the same. Every situation is different. I wouldn't suggest for a moment that in two situations the leader should be doing exactly the same thing,
Right.
but the advice on how you communicate, about how you set priorities and strategy, about how you support members of the organization and get them involved, completely engaged in solving those problems. I'm struck again and again at the parallel between best leadership practice and best crisis leadership. So, my answer is that the stakes are much higher, but a lot of what makes a great leader is true in both those circumstances. Maybe the one caveat I'll give to that is that there's an extra challenge that only exists in moments of crisis because of the human stakes, right? So you could have leaders that are skilled and otherwise effective that might lose the capacity to manage themselves at a type of time of crisis. And of course, being able first to control yourself is necessary before you can be effective in leading others. That's true in various moments, but I suppose there might be some circumstances when the world is kind of calmer and easier to lead in that we don't discover that leaders are missing one of those key elements. But generally, I would say that if you're a great crisis leader, you should expect to be a great leader at other moments.
Right. Very good. That's great. All right. A question came in from Gigi, and it says, what would be your suggestion for leaders who are on this call today who are witnessing leaders higher up who could be more present, be more visible? So managing up during a crisis.
Mm. Yeah, well, managing up is one of the real challenges. Um, and it, of course, depends on who your leader is. And I think one of the key approaches to managing up is you've got to realize it's not an exercise of power, which is much easier, but it's influence. And influence is hard. You've got to kind of lead someone to decide themselves that, in this case, more communication and presence would be necessary. I'll tell you that I myself have had and seen some positive experiences with leadership during this crisis of that kind of leading up. That I've seen management teams tell the leader that they need presence, they need some communication to the whole organization. I've seen the leaders be responsive. So, you could do that in a way that, makes it possible for the leader to absorb by reporting on, look, was visiting the shop floor and there's some anxiety there. I think they would really like to hear from you, even if you don't have all the answers. So you could tell them some of the things you see in the world that makes it more likely and more necessary that they should be present. And when they do even pieces of that presence, reinforce it positively. I've actually also had the chance to see some leaders who gave the all hands speech to the organization and then were thrilled to get the positive feedback. And they were reminded that sealed the lesson for them that the organization needs their presence.
Exactly. Well, this is sort of the follow-up to that one, in the sense of coming from the perspective of the leader from Nishi. Says, is it okay for a leader then who's being open to admit that he or she doesn't know what to do?
Yeah. Um, My answer to that is yes, and nobody is going to be fooled by a leader who suggests they have all the answers in a moment of crisis. Now, at the same time, let's understand what we're admitting. We're talking about honesty in the response to a situation. We're not talking about helplessness. It is
Right.
debilitating to an organization if the leader says, we're in crisis and I've got no idea how to go forward.
Right.
You want to have the message that you see a way forward and you're moving forward. These are the priorities for success. We're learning how to reach these priorities, but this is the direction we're going in. At the same time that you don't claim to say, I know everything that is going to get us there, right? So it's that combination of, I know what success looks like, and we don't know everything about how we're going to reach that success in this moment. If you don't do that, if you were to claim that you have certainty in all these answers, when if it's truly a crisis, the people in the middle of it will know that there's no certainty, then you're going to lose trust. When you lose trust, you're going to make the people in the organization anxious and afraid. You're going to lose really the capacity to lead them, right? So honesty, but hope, and the leader can't give up on their responsibility to present the strategy and the priorities for success, even if they can't claim to have all the answers on how to execute those priorities.
Right. Well, and in that sense, then, what I think a lot of people, and this is a great question that came in, are dealing with right now is not just dealing with the crisis, but dealing with how their company has to change. And so, the question is, how do you motivate people to reinvent a business and be on board with change?
Yeah. Well, there is some good news in that part of openness to change is an understanding that the status quo just won't work anymore. As long as people think the old way of doing things they could continue, they're going to be tempted to cling to that because change is costly and it's scary. And in a time of crisis, you can certainly expect that the message, we can't keep doing things the way we've been doing, will be more openly received. At the same time, the other thing that people really need at a time of crisis is a vision of the future. Right now, it may not be a complete path on how to get there, but at the same time, you say, well, the old way doesn't work. You've got to fill in the gap and tell them something about where they're trying to get to. And then pull in their energy and creativity about how to get there. Don't crowd out the contributions they can make by claiming to have all the answers yourself. But the leader has to have that vision. And here's the good news. I have seen, in fact, with teams working in the middle of this crisis, I've seen that some of the most electric moments come when the team starts to think, next quarter, as soon as we're through this current moment, what can we do given this new world to make us, our customers, our stakeholders, our employees more successful? The team lights up, right? So
Yeah.
if you give people a chance to start thinking about a better future, they want to do that now. And some of the things that have come out of those conversations, I think have been really creative and promising, right? So I credit your energy around leading the team forward to change. I think you'll find if you do it with some positive view of the future that you're going to get a lot of help in that.
I think that's great, Paul, because I think the point you're making there, I think this we're at 12:30 now, so this is a great finale, is that you're saying it's not just about leading in the crisis, but it's about also then thinking about leading out of the crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we're in a world now as leaders that we're back and forth between crises. Let's be honest, there'll be another one of a different character we can't anticipate in the next 3 years. Each organization has their own crisis. So that transition is, I think, going to become part of what we have to manage as leaders. I really love the way you put it, Scott.
Right. Well, Paul, this is, again, so many great questions came in, so much interest, and we certainly, the time right now that we're in, this is important information. Thank you so much for joining us today. And to all of you who joined us, on behalf of Columbia Business School Executive Education, thank you for joining us. Please be safe, be well, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks to Scott and everybody.